Sophia was a woman of immeasurable talent. Her hands could breathe life into stone, and her visions transformed raw marble into emotions so palpable that people often found themselves lost in tears before her sculptures. To the world, she was a genius, an artist who could reveal the deepest desires and vulnerabilities of the human soul. To Ethan, her husband of 5 years, she was everything. Their relationship seemed idyllic. Shared laughter over late-night wine, spontaneous weekend getaways, and stolen kisses in her sunlit studio. Ethan adored Sophia, not just for her beauty, but for the way her creativity burned so brightly it could warm even the coldest hearts. Her studio, nestled in the corner of their sprawling home, was her sanctuary. Ethan respected her need for solitude while working, rarely crossing the threshold without her invitation. It was her world, and he was content to marvel at her creations once they were ready to be shown. Yet, there was one room within the studio that remained locked. A simple wooden door, unassuming but steadfastly closed to him. "It's just storage," Sophia had said when he asked about it early in their marriage, her tone light but final. Ethan hadn't pushed the matter. Everyone deserved their privacy, especially an artist. But lately, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Sophia had been working late into the night, her soft humming drifting through the house long after he had gone to bed. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere even during their most intimate moments. And there was the faintest trace of something unfamiliar on her. A scent, subtle but unrecognizable, clinging to her skin like a ghost. One afternoon, Ethan stood in the doorway of her studio, watching her as she sculpted. Her hands moved deftly over the clay, shaping it with a precision that spoke of years of practice. The figure was masculine, its muscular form emerging under her touch like a memory brought to life. "Who is he?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Sophia froze for a split second before resuming her work. "No one," she said, her voice steady. "Just a figment of my imagination." Ethan smiled, but his stomach churned. She had never lied to him before. In that moment, Ethan decided. He would find out what lay behind that locked door. The forbidden room held secrets, and he was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The locked door began to consume Ethan's thoughts. What could Sophia possibly be hiding? The more he thought about it, the more the mundane excuses she'd given him over the years seemed like carefully placed diversions. In the days that followed, Ethan started noticing patterns. Sophia's late-night studio sessions grew longer, and she often returned to bed with a satisfied, almost dreamy expression. Her sculptures, once focused on themes of love and loss, had taken on a more sensual edge. The figure she'd been working on, the muscular man, was just one of several she seemed particularly protective of, covering them with sheets whenever Ethan entered the studio. One evening, Sophia left for an art exhibit downtown. She invited Ethan to join, but he feigned exhaustion, claiming a long day at work. As soon as her car disappeared down the driveway, he made his way to the studio. The room was as he expected, filled with the faint scent of clay and varnish, tools neatly arranged on the workbench, and unfinished pieces scattered throughout. But his eyes quickly landed on the locked door. He tried the handle. It was, of course, locked tight. His hands trembled as he bent down to inspect the keyhole. It wasn't just a standard lock. It was custom-made, the kind of thing someone used to guard a treasure or a secret. Ethan wasn't one to give up easily. He rummaged through the drawers, searching for anything that might open the door. Keys, tools, even something that could pick the lock. As he searched, his mind raced. What if she was hiding something innocent? A surprise for him, perhaps? But deep down, he knew better. In one of the drawers, he found a small, worn journal. Sophia wasn't one for writing. She preferred to express herself through her art. Curious, he opened it. The pages weren't filled with words but sketches. Intricate, detailed drawings of male figures, each one more sensual than the last. Beneath the sketches were brief notes in Sophia's handwriting. Matthew, the strength in his hands. Daniel, the curve of his jaw, perfect. Adrian, eyes that burn into the soul. Ethan's stomach dropped. These weren't imaginary figures, they were real men, The realization hit him like a physical blow. These were the subjects of her sculptures, her inspirations. But why had she kept this from him? He closed the journal, his heart pounding, and turned back to the locked door. Whatever was inside, it would give him the answers he needed. Sophia returned home late that night to find Ethan in bed, pretending to be asleep. She slipped under the covers, her skin cold from the night air. Ethan lay still, his mind racing with plans. He would find a way into that room, and when he did, he would know the truth. Days turned into weeks, but the image of that locked door haunted Ethan. He couldn't shake the sketches from his mind. Men with features so vivid they couldn't be imaginary. Each note was intimate, almost worshipful. He began to notice new details about Sophia. How she always locked the studio door behind her. How her phone notifications were silenced whenever she worked. How she seemed to light up whenever she mentioned her creative process. One evening, while Sophia was in the shower, Ethan searched her phone. She rarely left it unattended, but tonight she had been careless. His hands trembled as he unlocked it, scrolling through her messages, emails, and photos. At first, there was nothing unusual. But then he found an album tucked away in a hidden folder labeled Simply Inspiration. Inside were photos of men, all half-dressed or nude, their bodies posed in ways that felt too familiar. Ethan recognized some of the faces from the sketches in the journal. His chest tightened as he realized the truth. These weren't just models. They were her lovers. Ethan's mind reeled. Was this what she had been doing during her studio hours? Bringing men into their home, into her sacred space, and immortalizing them in clay while betraying him? The idea was unbearable. The next morning, Sophia left early for an art supply run. Determined, Ethan went back to the studio. This time, he came prepared. He'd watched countless lock-picking tutorials online and practiced on a spare padlock until his fingers were nimble. The lock gave way with a soft click, and the door creaked open. The air inside was cooler, the scent of varnish and stone sharper here. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and when they did, he froze. The room was filled with sculptures, more than he could count. Each one was a masterpiece, detailed to perfection. But it wasn't their craftsmanship that made his breath catch. It was the unmistakable familiarity of their faces. These were the men from the sketches, from the photos. Their bodies were captured in poses that ranged from artistic to blatantly sensual. Some were reclining, others standing tall, their gazes hauntingly alive. The room felt like a twisted garden, a shrine to Sophia's infidelity. In the center of the room stood the latest sculpture, the one she had been working on so fervently. It wasn't finished yet, but Ethan recognized the face. It was his. His stomach churned as he stepped closer. Her betrayal wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional. She was turning him into one of them, one of her muses. Ethan backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. The fury boiling inside him was like nothing he'd ever felt before. But his rage wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was cold, calculated. If Sophia wanted to immortalize her lovers, he would ensure she paid the ultimate price for her artistry. Ethan couldn't confront Sophia, not yet. The discovery of her forbidden garden left him seething. But he knew his revenge needed to be methodical, precise. Confrontation would only give her a chance to manipulate or deny. Instead, he resolved to let her dig her own grave while he set his trap. That evening, when Sophia returned, she greeted him with her usual warmth. Ethan forced a smile, hiding the storm brewing inside. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing him lightly. "Productive," he replied, his tone steady. "Yours?" "Busy but good," she said, glancing toward the studio. "I've been making great progress on a piece." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he quickly masked his reaction. "That's wonderful. I can't wait to see it when it's done." As Sophia disappeared into her studio, Ethan began gathering the tools he'd need for his plan. Over the next few days, he set up discreet cameras around the house, particularly near the studio entrance. If she was bringing men into their home, he would have proof. Meanwhile, he subtly pried into Sophia's routines, noting her behavior and timing her comings and goings. He feigned interest in her work, asking innocent questions about her process. Each time she spoke, her enthusiasm was genuine, her passion for her art unmistakable. But to Ethan, it all felt like a twisted mockery of their marriage. One night, as Sophia slept soundly beside him, Ethan reviewed the footage from the cameras. His heart pounded as he fast-forwarded through hours of recordings. Then, at 2 a.m., his suspicions were confirmed. A man arrived at their home, entering through the side door Sophia had left unlocked. Ethan watched as she greeted him with a smile, leading him into the studio. The door closed behind them, and they didn't emerge for hours. Ethan clenched his fists, his vision blurring with rage. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a carefully orchestrated betrayal carried out under his roof. The next morning, Ethan acted as though nothing had changed. He made breakfast, complimented Sophia on her work, and kissed her goodbye as she left for an errand. But inside, his resolve hardened. That afternoon, he returned to the forbidden room. This time, he wasn't there to discover more secrets. He was there to prepare it for what was to come. He worked meticulously, altering the sculptures in subtle ways. He used tools from her own collection to carve haunting expressions onto their faces, twisting their perfect features into grotesque parodies. He carefully positioned them so that when Sophia entered, they would seem to be staring directly at her. In the center of the room, he placed her unfinished sculpture of him. But he added a new detail, a set of chains draped artfully across its chest, hinting at what he intended to do next. Ethan stepped back, surveying his work. The room had been her sanctuary, a shrine to her deceit. Now it was a stage for her downfall. When Sophia returned home that evening, Ethan was waiting for her, calm and composed. "I was thinking," he said casually, "maybe you could show me what you've been working on. I'd love to see it." Sophia hesitated, her smile faltering. "It's not ready yet. You'll see it when it's finished." Ethan nodded, pretending to accept her excuse. But he knew the time was coming when she would have no choice but to face the horrifying truth he had crafted for her. Ethan knew the key to his revenge was patience. Confronting Sophia directly would only give her the chance to explain away her actions or twist the narrative. Instead, he focused on planting seeds of doubt and fear, eroding her sense of control over the life she had so carefully curated. Over the following days, Ethan began dropping subtle hints. He left small, seemingly inconsequential items from her studio, tools, scraps of clay, outside the locked room. He rearranged a few sculptures just slightly, enough to unsettle her but not enough to arouse outright suspicion. One evening, while they were having dinner, Ethan casually asked, "Do you ever feel like your art has a life of its own?" Sophia glanced up from her plate, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "Well," Ethan continued, swirling his wine glass, "your sculptures are so lifelike. Sometimes, it feels like they're watching me when I'm in the studio." Sophia laughed nervously. "That's the goal, isn't it? To make them feel alive." Ethan smiled. "Of course, you've certainly mastered that." That night, while Sophia worked late in her studio, Ethan took the next step. He slipped into her phone again, this time using it to send cryptic messages to one of her lovers. Messages that seemed to come from her. "Do you ever wonder what happens if someone finds out? You should stay away for a while. It's too risky now." The next day, Sophia seemed tense, her usual confidence slightly shaken. Ethan watched her closely, feigning concern. "Everything okay?" he asked as she sat quietly with her coffee. "Yeah," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Ethan nodded, pretending to believe her. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." But inside, he reveled in her unease. The cracks were beginning to show. Later that week, Sophia returned home to find the studio door slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. Everything seemed in place, but the sense of violation lingered. "Did you go into the studio today?" she asked Ethan that evening. He raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "No, why?" "The door was open," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Maybe you forgot to lock it." Ethan suggested, his tone casual. Sophia nodded, but her unease was palpable. That night, Ethan crept into the forbidden room once more. This time, he made his changes more noticeable. He moved one of the sculptures closer to the door, angling it so its lifeless eyes seemed to be watching whoever entered. He added faint scratch marks to the walls, as if something or someone had tried to claw their way out. By the time Sophia walked into the room the next day, the effect was undeniable. She stood frozen in the doorway, her breath hitching as she took in the subtle but unnerving changes. Her heart pounded as she backed out of the room, locking the door behind her. But even as she tried to brush it off, a seed of doubt had been planted. For the first time, her sanctuary no longer felt safe. Ethan watched her closely that evening, hiding his satisfaction as she nervously avoided the studio. He knew the game was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place. Sophia couldn't shake the growing unease that clung to her like a shadow. The studio, once her sanctuary, now felt like an alien space. The subtle changes, the misplaced tools, the sculptures that seemed to shift positions, gnawed at her nerves. She told herself it was just exhaustion or an overactive imagination, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. Ethan, meanwhile, maintained his role as the loving, supportive husband, though his every action was calculated to escalate Sophia's paranoia. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Ethan brought up a story he had read online. "Did you hear about that artist in France?" he asked casually. Sophia looked up from her sketchpad. "No, what about them?" "Apparently, someone broke into their studio and vandalized their work, completely ruined it. They didn't even realize it until they noticed the sculptures looked off." Sophia froze for a moment before laughing nervously. "That's terrible. Who would do something like that?" Ethan shrugged. "Jealousy, maybe? Or someone trying to send a message. Makes you think, doesn't it? How fragile art really is." Sophia nodded, but her mind was already racing. She didn't sleep much that night, replaying Ethan's words over and over. The next day, she decided to check on her sculptures. The forbidden room still felt cold and unwelcoming, but she steeled herself and unlocked the door. As she stepped inside, her breath caught. One of the sculptures, a particularly striking piece of a man reclining with an air of confidence, had changed. His face, once serene and alluring, now bore faint scratches, as if someone had tried to claw away his expression. Sophia's heart pounded. She ran her fingers over the marks, trying to convince herself they had always been there. But she knew her work intimately, and this wasn't her doing. "Ethan?" she called later that evening as they prepared dinner. He replied, chopping vegetables. "Have you been in my studio recently?" He looked up, his brow furrowed. "No, why?" "No reason," she said quickly, turning back to the stove. Ethan's lips curled into a slight smile as he turned away. Later that night, Sophia received an anonymous text message. "You can't hide forever." Her hands trembled as she read it. Was it one of her lovers? Had someone discovered her secret? She deleted the message but couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Ethan watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But Ethan knew better. The pressure was building, and soon, Sophia's carefully constructed facade would crumble. Sophia's nerves were fraying. The once familiar confines of her life felt foreign, threatening. The strange text, the altered sculptures, and her growing suspicion that Ethan might know something were driving her to the brink. She began locking her studio obsessively, double-checking the doors and windows, and keeping her phone close at all times. Ethan, meanwhile, continued his quiet torment. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated to push Sophia further into paranoia. He began leaving subtle traces of his presence in her studio. Fingerprints on her tools, a faint smell of his cologne in the air. Each time Sophia noticed, her anxiety deepened. One evening, as Sophia prepared to work late in her studio, Ethan approached her with a glass of wine. "You've been working so hard," he said, handing her the glass. You should take a break. I can't, she said, barely looking at him. I'm behind on my deadlines. Ethan nodded, his face calm but his mind spinning with dark amusement. Don't work too hard, he said, kissing her on the forehead before retreating to bed. Once she was alone, Sophia unlocked the forbidden room. The sight of her sculptures, illuminated by the dim studio light, filled her with a mixture of pride and unease. She moved to her newest piece, the unfinished sculpture of Ethan. As she adjusted the light to work on the figure, she froze. Something was wrong. The chains Ethan had draped over the sculpture were now embedded into the figure's arms, as if they were part of the original design. They looked unnervingly real, glinting in the faint light. Sophia staggered back, her heart racing. She hadn't done this. Someone else had. Her phone buzzed on the nearby workbench, startling her. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and saw another anonymous message. Do you see the truth yet? The words sent a chill down her spine. She dropped the phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Who was doing this? And how had they managed to get inside her sacred space? Sophia didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the living room, every light in the house turned on, clutching her phone as if it could protect her. Ethan found her there in the morning, her eyes bloodshot and her hands shaking. Are you okay? He asked, feigning concern. Sophia nodded quickly. Just a rough night. You've seemed distracted lately, Ethan said, sitting beside her. Is something going on? She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. I'm fine. But Ethan knew she was anything but fine. His plan was working perfectly. Sophia's sense of control was slipping, her carefully guarded secrets threatening to spill over. As she sat in silence, Ethan's mind churned with the next stage of his revenge. The time was coming to reveal just how deeply he had infiltrated her world, and how far he was willing to go to make her pay. Sophia's world began to blur. Days and nights passed in a haze as her paranoia consumed her. She avoided the forbidden room entirely, unable to face the eerie sculptures or the unsettling changes she couldn't explain. Ethan, ever the devoted husband, began to subtly isolate her further. He suggested she take time off from her gallery commitments, claiming she looked exhausted. When she protested, he reminded her how much her health mattered, that he only wanted what was best for her. Slowly, Sophia retreated further into herself, her confidence in her work and her surroundings unraveling. One night, Ethan made his next move. While Sophia slept fitfully in the bedroom, he slipped into the forbidden room. Using a small speaker system he had discreetly installed, he recorded faint whispers, barely audible phrases spoken in a haunting tone. Why did you do this? You can't escape us. We see everything. He set the system on a timer, ensuring it would play during the quiet hours of the night when Sophia worked. The following evening, as Sophia finally gathered the courage to return to the studio, the whispers began. First, she thought it was her imagination, a faint sound, like a breeze through the cracks. But as she worked, the whispers grew clearer. Liar! Sophia froze, her chisel slipping from her hand and clattering onto the floor. Her heart raced as she glanced around the room, her breath coming in short gasps. Who's there? She whispered, her voice trembling. The room was silent. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just stress, just her mind playing tricks on her. But as she reached for her tools again, another whisper echoed through the room. We know what you've done. Sophia screamed, stumbling backward. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the sculptures. Their blank, lifeless gazes seemed to bore into her, accusing her, condemning her. She fled the studio, slamming the door behind her and collapsing against the wall. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to catch her breath. When Ethan found her curled up in the hallway, he rushed to her side, feigning alarm. Sophia, what's wrong? He asked, his voice filled with concern. I don't know, she stammered. Something's wrong in the studio. I keep hearing things. Ethan pulled her into his arms, stroking her hair. You've been under so much pressure lately, he said softly. Maybe it's time to take a step back. Clear your mind. Sophia nodded weakly, too shaken to argue. But as Ethan held her, his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The whispers were only the beginning. Soon, Sophia would question not just her surroundings, but her very sanity. Sophia became a shell of herself in the days that followed. She stopped going into her studio altogether, leaving her work unfinished and collecting dust. She avoided Ethan's questions about her well-being, brushing him off with weak reassurances that she just needed rest. But inside, her mind was spiraling. Ethan, however, knew the time had come to push her closer to the edge. His plan was nearly complete, and the final act required precision. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ethan brought up an invitation he'd received. "I ran into Lisa from the gallery today," he said casually. "She's hosting an exclusive art showcase next week. They're expecting some big names." Sophia barely looked up from her plate. "That's nice. I mentioned you might want to unveil one of your pieces," he continued. She was thrilled at the idea. Sophia's fork clattered onto her plate. "What? Why would you do that?" "I thought it might help you," Ethan said, feigning innocence. "Get back on track. Remind everyone why you're so brilliant." "No," she said sharply, shaking her head. "I'm not ready. None of my work is." "Are you sure?" Ethan pressed. "You've been working so hard. I think people would love to see what you've been creating." Sophia's eyes darted toward the studio door, her face pale. "I said no, Ethan." Ethan leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Of course. If you're not ready, I won't push you." That night, as Sophia slept fitfully, Ethan executed the next phase of his plan. He contacted Lisa himself, arranging for the special piece to be delivered to the gallery under Sophia's name. He chose the most damning sculpture from the Forbidden Room, a piece that unmistakably resembled one of Sophia's secret lovers. He worked through the night, carefully packing the sculpture and ensuring its delivery would go unnoticed by Sophia. The next morning, Sophia woke to find Ethan already in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. He greeted her warmly, showing no sign of his late-night activity. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "You look like you slept better." "Barely," she muttered, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Ethan studied her for a moment before adding, "Maybe some fresh air would help. We could visit the gallery later, see what Lisa's working on." Sophia shook her head, not meeting his gaze. "I'm not in the mood." Ethan shrugged, hiding his satisfaction. He didn't need her to go with him. The wheels were already in motion. By the end of the day, the sculpture had been delivered to the gallery and prominently displayed among the other pieces for the showcase. Its sensual, lifelike form drew immediate attention, and whispers began circulating about its striking resemblance to a well-known art dealer in their social circle, a man Sophia had worked with privately on several occasions. Ethan watched the fallout from a distance, his satisfaction growing with each passing moment. When Sophia inevitably found out, her carefully curated world would crumble in front of everyone she cared about. The trap was set, and now all Ethan had to do was wait. The day of the gallery showcase arrived. Ethan attended alone, as Sophia had refused to leave the house. She'd been restless and paranoid, pacing the living room and avoiding his questions about her work. Ethan reassured her he'd go in her place, promising to observe everything and share any feedback from her admirers. At the gallery, Ethan navigated the crowded space with calm composure. The attendees marveled at the art, sipping wine and exchanging murmured praises. Then, like wildfire, whispers about the featured sculpture began spreading. "It's so lifelike. Do you think it's him? Is this Sophia's work? It's incredible and scandalous." Ethan approached the piece, feigning surprise at its unveiling. It stood in the center of the room, bold and unmissable. The unmistakable likeness of a man, sensual and raw, captured in an intimate pose that left little to the imagination. It wasn't just any man, it was Adrian, a well-known art dealer and one of Sophia's secret lovers. The detail was too precise for coincidence. Lisa, the gallery owner, approached Ethan with a mix of awe and concern. "I had no idea Sophia was submitting a piece," she said. "It's stunning, but Provocative. Ethan smiled faintly, his voice calm. She wanted it to be a surprise. I'm sure she'll be delighted to hear the reception. Meanwhile, back at home, Sophia's phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages poured in from colleagues, friends, and even Adrian himself. What were you thinking? We need to talk. This isn't funny. Why would you do this to me? Sophia stared at the messages, her blood running cold. Her heart pounded as she opened her gallery's social media feed. The first image she saw was of the sculpture, surrounded by onlookers, with captions calling it daring and controversial. She clutched the phone tightly, her hands trembling. No, she whispered to herself. This can't be happening. As panic consumed her, Ethan walked through the door, his face a mask of concern. What's wrong? He asked, feigning ignorance. Sophia shoved her phone toward him. That sculpture, it's at the gallery. How? I didn't submit anything. Ethan's eyes widened, perfectly mimicking shock. What? That's impossible. You're the only one with access to your work. Sophia shook her head violently. I didn't send it. Someone else must have. Her voice trailed off as her thoughts spiraled. Who could have done this? Ethan stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Sophia, he said gently, maybe this is a sign. Maybe you've been pushing yourself too hard. And things slipped through the cracks. She stared at him, her mind a chaotic storm of fear and confusion. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't right. As Sophia sat down, burying her face in her hands, Ethan's mask slipped for a brief moment. His lips curled into a cold, triumphant smile. The first part of his revenge was complete. But there was more to come, much more. Sophia couldn't leave the house. The gallery fiasco had spiraled out of control, with whispers spreading through her social and professional circles. Everyone seemed to know the truth, or at least suspect it. Adrian had called her relentlessly, his tone shifting from confusion to anger. You've ruined me, he shouted in his last voicemail. Ethan, ever the supportive husband, feigned ignorance. I'm sure this will blow over, he said, stroking her hair as she sat on the couch, her face pale and gaunt. But Sophia's mind was racing. She knew someone had done this to her, and the whispers in her studio still haunted her. At night, she lay awake, the darkness pressing in around her. It felt as though the sculptures were watching her, their judgmental gazes piercing through walls. She was trapped, suffocating under the weight of her own secrets and the growing sense that her world was unraveling. Sophia's paranoia peaked when she discovered her journal, the one with sketches of her lovers, had been moved. She flipped through the pages frantically, noticing annotations that weren't hers. He deserved better. The truth always comes out. Her hands shook as she clutched the journal. Someone had found her secrets and was using them against her. That night, Ethan handed her a glass of wine and sat beside her. You've been so distant lately, he said softly. I need to ask you something, she blurted, staring at him with wide eyes. Have you been in my studio? Have you seen my work? Ethan tilted his head, feigning hurt. Why would you ask that? You know I respect your space. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered. Someone's doing this to me, Ethan. Someone knows. Ethan gently took her hand. Maybe it's time to come clean, Sophia. Secrets have a way of destroying people. His words felt like a dagger to her chest, and for the first time, she wondered if her husband was no longer the man she thought he was. Sophia's mind fractured under the weight of her guilt and fear. Every sound in the house felt like a whisper from her sculptures, every shadow a judgmental gaze. She no longer trusted Ethan, but she didn't have the strength to confront him. Ethan, sensing her breaking point, made his final move. One night, he left a small note on her pillow, written in her own handwriting. Confess, or we'll all come alive. Sophia woke to the note and screamed, trembling as she clutched it. She ran to her studio, unlocking the forbidden room with shaking hands. Inside, the sculptures had been rearranged. They stood in a circle, all facing her, their distorted features now glaring in silent condemnation. Sophia collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the cold, unfeeling figures. "I'm so sorry." As Sophia crumbled in the center of her studio, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his presence startling her. She looked up, her tear-streaked face a portrait of despair. "You!" she whispered, realization dawning. "It was you all along." Ethan stepped inside, his expression calm, almost serene. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think your garden of lovers could stay hidden forever?" Sophia shook her head, crawling backward. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she pleaded. "It wasn't. Intent doesn't erase betrayal." Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. "But don't worry. I've immortalized your legacy. Everyone knows now." Sophia's breath hitched. The gallery, the whispers, the texts, it had all been his doing. "I wanted you to feel what I felt," Ethan continued. "The humiliation, the loss, the isolation." Sophia sobbed, clutching her chest. "Please, Ethan. I'll do anything to fix this." But Ethan only smiled, turning toward the door. "Some things can't be fixed, Sophia. This is your masterpiece. Live with it." He left her there, surrounded by the haunting remains of her secrets, her cries echoing through the empty house. Weeks passed, and Sophia was a ghost of her former self. The gallery scandal had obliterated her reputation, and whispers of her infidelity continued to spread through the art world. The forbidden room, once her sanctuary, now stood locked and abandoned, its contents a cruel reminder of her downfall. Ethan moved out shortly after their confrontation, leaving her with the house and the weight of her guilt. He filed for divorce, his demeanor icy but composed. Sophia didn't fight him. She didn't have the energy. In his new life, Ethan thrived. He took satisfaction in knowing that his revenge had been absolute, leaving Sophia with nothing but the remnants of her betrayal. As for Sophia, she stopped sculpting entirely. Her hands, once capable of creating lifelike masterpieces, now trembled too much to hold a chisel. Alone in the house, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, she spent her days in silence, her once brilliant mind consumed by the echoes of Ethan's parting words. "This is your masterpiece. Live with it."